On July the 18th, 2008, The Dark Knight is released in the US. The film goes on to become a cultural phenomenon, grossing $1 billion. It also earns an Oscar win for the deceased Heath Ledger, and is selected by the United States Library of Congress for preservation in the National Film Registry. That film was directed by this man, Christopher Nolan. However, in this video, I'm going to tell you how this man, the legendary Stanley Kubrick, who died 9 years before the film was released, made The Dark Knight. The year is 1960. Stanley Kubrick has just finished work on his historical epic, Spartacus. Kubrick was never the first choice for this film. Instead, 1 week into filming, original director Anthony Mann was fired from the production, and the legendary lead actor and producer Kirk Douglas, father of Michael Douglas, contacted Kubrick and asked him to take over. He was just 32 years old at the time. The two had worked together on Kubrick's war masterpiece, Paths of Glory. The film's screenwriter, Dalton Trumbo, was blacklisted at the time. He was one of the Hollywood 10 individuals who were accused of having an involvement with the Communist Party, where he and the other 9 were treated like pariahs. A story that we'll go into another time. But this fact might just explain the film's ending. However, Kubrick was reluctant to accept for 2 reasons. A, he'd not been involved in any pre-production or script development, and Kubrick was notorious for his attention to detail and wanting full control. And B, this was a huge budget for this feature, coming in at $12 million, which is equivalent to $125 million now. For context, Paths of Glory was made for just $900,000, a budget almost 13 times smaller. He was dubious about having such a large-scale budget and having a studio call in the absolute shots. For a man who craved control, this was daunting for him. But Kubrick knew that if he nailed this film, his power in Hollywood would rise exponentially and give him the freedom that he yearned for, to have complete autonomy on future productions. All he needed to do was steer the ship that was already in motion to the shore, and for the film to be a huge financial and critical success. Which is easy, right? Fast forward, the year 2004, British director Christopher Nolan has just finished work on his comic book epic Batman Begins. Nolan was never the first choice for this film. Director Darren Aronofsky, fresh off his hit Requiem for a Dream, was one of the most sought-after directors in Hollywood. And he had written a spec script for a Batman film, something dark and primal. The last couple of Batman movies were a flop. Batman and Robin almost ended the franchise.
$7 million. Never leave the cave without it.
And pretty much ended the credibility of its director and almost its lead actor. However, Aronofsky and the studio weren't seen eye to eye on a few creative points. But Warner Brothers really wanted their franchise back to the heights that Tim Burton had brought it to in the late 80s and early 90s. Nolan had just made 3 films. His last film, the 2002 remake of Norwegian thriller Insomnia, was made with Warner Brothers. And now they wanted him to helm the return of the franchise. Nolan was reluctant to accept for 2 reasons. A, he wasn't a huge comic book fan, especially Batman. B, there was a huge budget for the feature. Before this film, his biggest budget was for Insomnia. He was dubious about having such a large-scale budget and having a studio calling the absolute shots on a genre he wasn't too drawn to. It was a risk. For a man who craved absolute control, this was daunting for him. But Nolan knew that if he nailed this film, his power in Hollywood would rise exponentially and give him the freedom he yearned to have complete autonomy on future productions. Now already, we're beginning to see a clearly evident crossover between these two individuals. Both strain out of their tightly gripped comfort zones in order to expand the lengths of their comfort zones for the future, and both aggressively intent on control. Back to 1960, and Spartacus opens on the 6th of October and grosses $17 million. Adjusted for inflation, that's $366 million. It went to win 4 Oscars: Best Supporting Actor, Best Art Direction, Best Costume Design, and Best Cinematography. The film gives Kubrick the freedom of Hollywood. He had proven he can tackle big budgets, and now the 32-year-old director has big plans. First, the American director decides to tackle the controversial novel Lolita, shot in the UK, a place potentially owing to a fear of flying. He decides to reside for the rest of his life. The film that he had put off making to take on Spartacus was a financial success, and is a film that directors such as David Lynch, Sofia Coppola, and Paul Thomas Anderson cite amongst their favorite films ever. And then he opts to direct another grounded project in Dr. Strangelove, a dark comedy about nuclear war, during a decade when nuclear war was a very serious possibility. And this was due to the ever-growing hostility between the US and the USSR, now Russia. Ever since World War II and the inception of nuclear arms, which was brought about by the Manhattan Project, fronted by J. Robert Oppenheimer. However, his next project would be one that would go on to change cinema forever. Meanwhile, back in 2005, June 15, Batman Begins is released in the US. The film grosses $373 million. It revitalizes the Batman franchise and garners an Oscar nomination for Wally Pfizer for Best Cinematography. The film takes the 35-year-old promising director from cult status director to one of the biggest directors in Hollywood, and all overnight. Just as he had planned, he now has the freedom of Hollywood. He had proven he can tackle big budgets. He now had big plans. First, the British director decides to tackle the novel The Prestige, the film that he had put off making to take on Batman Begins. And it was a financial and critical success. Warner Brothers financed the whole film. They knew they had a director they could trust on their hands, and they didn't want him to get away. They had him on a contract to direct the Batman trilogy. The Prestige showed the world what Nolan could do with a bigger budget and more creative control. However, his next project would be one that would go on to change cinema.
He wanted to take us places we could never have imagined, and so he imagined them for us. He is Stanley Kubrick. He died before he could witness the century he had already made famous with 2001: A Space Odyssey. Stanley wanted us to see his movies absolutely as he envisioned them. He never gave an inch on that. He dared us to have the courage of his convictions. And when we take that dare, we're transported directly to his world, and we're inside his vision. And in the whole history of movies, there has been nothing like that vision ever. It was a vision of hope and wonder, of grace and of mystery. It was a gift to us, and now it's a legacy. We will be challenged and nourished by that for as long as we keep the courage to take his dare. And I hope that will be long after we've said our thanks and our goodbyes.
It's tough to tell anyone how to approach 2001. It's, I think, of any of the great films, to me, it's one of the most personal, the one that you bring the most to as a viewer. The point of 2001 is the thing itself, is the experience itself. It needs to just wash over you and inform you through the immersion into this extraordinary world. Well, I first saw 2001 as a child. I was about 7 years old, and they re-released 2001 in the wake of the tremendous success of Star Wars. So the appetite for anything to do with science fiction then was massive. And my father took me to the Leicester Square Theatre, and it became this sort of seminal introduction to the power of cinema, what cinema can be. I remember the size of the screen, I remember the sense of awe. And over the years, my relationship with the film has evolved, but I think that first response is in many ways, I think, the truest response to 2001. I think it is primarily an emotional experience. It's something you feel.
1968. Space Odyssey 2001, for many of your favorite directors, is the film that turned them from casual movie consumer into fully fledged film enthusiasts. Even directors that you think have their own singularity when it comes to the art of filmmaking are simply following in the shadows of this film and this filmmaker. Ridley Scott's career has been almost a textbook example of one man following another. Even his Napoleon film is reminiscent of a Kubrick project which never quite got off the ground. In the 1970s, he had planned to make Napoleon with Jack Nicholson as the titular character. But it is Nolan who, in his own words, is highly influenced by the film. And he is the director who has most embodied Kubrick's career, and in a way, even evolved it. So in the year 2008, how exactly did a dead director of nearly 10 years make The Dark Knight? This is the opening elaborate heist scene from The Dark Knight, and this is from The Killing, a highly underrated heist film by Kubrick. This is an interview from actor Matthew Modine, actor from both Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket and Nolan's The Dark Knight Rises, where he cites both directors as being very similar in their approach to the filmmaking process.
Created a facade of that big voice and the scary face, and then Toto goes down and pulls the curtain back, and you see there's just this little Menchie guy that grew up in the Bronx who got in the movie business, making movies, and he created that facade in order to protect his art. He loved making movies more than anybody I've ever met. It's Christopher Nolan loves making movies. So there is a similarity between the two of them there.
The lead character in A Clockwork Orange, Kubrick's next film after Space Odyssey 2001, is called Alex. And Nolan shaped the character of the Joker on Alex, an antisocial, anti-establishment, chaos whirlwind of a character. Malcolm McDowell, the actor who played Alex, influenced Heath Ledger's iconic smirk. There are so many interwoven and complex droplets of the influence of Kubrick on the motion picture that is The Dark Knight, many of them unconsciously laden in the steel cage of creativity sitting in Nolan's cranium. The two directors, whether by chance or by design, share similar career paths, so much so that even criticisms of their most famous works by the authors of the novels they adapted have crossed over. We have Stephen King's The Shining.
Did you like Kubrick's film of The Shining?
No. Cold. Shelley Duvall as Wendy is really one of the most misogynistic characters ever put on film. She's basically just there to scream and be stupid, and that's not the woman that I wrote about.
Did you talk to Kubrick about it?
I met him on the set. I was over in England, just out on that one meeting that I thought that he was a very compulsive, almost like anal man.
And Christopher Priest's The Prestige, where the author also goes as far as to call Nolan a Kubrick wannabe.
I only ever had one meeting with him, which was when the film was finished.
Why?
Because I wasn't very interested in him. We all have different points of view on the world. But to the world, he's this great, innovative filmmaker. To me, he was a kid who wanted to get into Hollywood. I don't know whether you know the story of how The Prestige was bought. It was very much bought for him by Warner Brothers. He wasn't behind it as such. He made The Following in London. And then he's half American. He went to Hollywood. And somehow or other he got tied up with a company called Newmarket, who are affiliated to Warner Brothers. And they were looking for properties for this guy. And he was just then, he was about 21. Think about the movie. I think it's probably his best film with Memento. Of the films he's made, those two are supreme. I don't like his other work. I think it's shallow and badly written. I've got kids who like superheroes, and they think the Batman films as boring and pretentious. They like things like the Avengers and Iron Man because they're fun, and you know, he tries to make. It's a wrong move to take a superhero and give it psychological realism. There is no psychological realism. He's a bodybuilder who jumps off buildings. You know, what can you do? And I'm sorry, I feel really strongly about this. And I think the proof is in the audiences. I've been to the movie house theatres and seen things like Batman Begins and the second one, I forget what it's called. The Dark Knight. It's a real major lack of judgment in Nolan to go for superhero films. And I feel it's very strongly. What he's trying to be is a kind of modern Kubrick. And I think he'd be better off being a modern Hitchcock, basically, a maker of well-made films like Memento and The Prestige.
So back to July 18th, 2008. The Dark Knight is released in the US. The film goes on to becoming a cultural phenomenon and grosses $1 billion. To date, adjusted for inflation, it's Christopher Nolan's top grossing film. But make no mistake, this film is shaped in the image of Stanley Kubrick. Kubrick has been called many things over the years. Genius, a difficult director, the greatest director ever. All of which could be true. But one thing is for certain, he is the most influential director there has ever been.
I can't speak for other directors, but it feels like, you know, what he did was kind of a, you know, a watermark for all of us, just to say, like, this is how you should sort of treat what you do, and this is how you should address it, with a kind of attention and compassion.
Christopher Nolan is an extraordinary director. People often associate his work with the idea of control. However, Christopher Nolan is a director who thrives on the idea of chaos. And you can watch all about that by clicking this video here. And until we speak again, big love.